Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to be talking about the step-by-step process involved in staircasing your property if you own a property on shared ownership. This video will be useful for anyone who either owns a property on shared ownership and is looking to staircase, or anyone who's thinking about buying a shared ownership property and you just kind of want to know what it's going to look like further down the line should you decide to staircase. Now, I have actually done a video before talking about the pros and cons of shared ownership, so I'm not going to repeat any of what I've said there, but one or two things might be relevant and I might have to say them in this video, and I'll put a link below if you've not seen that and you're interested in watching that. Okay, so the first thing that you want to consider is, can you actually afford it? There's so many costs involved in actually staircasing, like, stamp duty, additional deposit, valuation fees, lenders fees, admin fees. There's so many little bits and pieces involved in actually staircasing, and it's worth actually knowing in advance what all of these costs are potentially going to look like before even starting the process, because if you start without having fully counted the cost later down the line, you might find that either you can't get a mortgage and you lose all the money that you've spent, or that it's not money that you have to actually spend right now. One thing I will say is that stamp duty and also the additional deposit might not necessarily be a requirement for everyone, and it's highly dependent on a number of things, like how much equity you actually have in your current percentage that you own, as well as how much stamp duty you actually paid when you bought the first 50% as well. Okay, so the first thing you want to actually do is figure out how much your property is actually now worth. And there's two ways you can go about doing this. You can either get a estate agent to come out to your property, and you can actually get them to come and give you a free valuation. If you are in lockdown mode, COVID mode, or you just don't want people coming into your house, the alternative and probably better way of doing it is actually going on Zoopla or Rightmove and looking at comparables, which are houses that are very similar to yours, if not exactly like yours, and any that have sold in the last 6 months. And that is a pretty good way of gauging the value of your property right now. Make sure they're the same in terms of the number of bedrooms, and try and get it as close as possible to the location of your actual flat. Okay, so why I think getting the value of your flat is the best first thing to do is firstly because it's free, and secondly this gives you an idea of how much you're actually going to have to pay for the additional percentage of the mortgage of the percentage of the house that you're trying to purchase, and therefore I assume mortgage that you're going to need to increase to. So throughout this video I'm just going to use 50% as an example because it's easy, and also I'm going to go with the assumption of actually staircasing from 50% to 100%. Shared ownership can actually be bought in a variety of percentages, and it can also be staircased in a variety of percentages. So to keep it simple, it's going to be 50 to 100 throughout this video as my example. Okay, so now that you know the potential value of your flat, the whole flat at full market value, this gives you an idea of how much of a mortgage you're probably going to need to afford to own the whole flat. And very quickly you can do some calculations on whether you think a mortgage lender will be willing to actually give you a mortgage on the entire property. Now you can go online and actually put in your current salary, and if you're buying with a partner, put in their salary as well, and calculate how much house can I afford. And there's many calculators online. I'll put a link to a couple below that enable you to actually see how much you could potentially borrow based on your affordability. The other thing I would say that is probably worth keeping in mind is I would take some of those calculators with a pinch of salt, because I've put my salary in some of these in the past and found the results quite depressing, to say the least. I couldn't afford the amount that I needed to afford to buy the house, and I actually got in touch with a mortgage broker. At the time it was Which Mortgage Brokers, which unfortunately don't exist anymore, but they were actually able to find banks that were willing to lend more than the standard kind of 4 times your salary or 5 times your salary, and this was great because it meant that I could then purchase a house more than, you know, what the online calculators were actually saying. So I do think it's worth actually trying to get a mortgage broker if you find that the calculators aren't giving you the numbers that you want. It is important to obviously not over leverage yourself. Don't get more mortgage than you can afford. More often than not, each bank will do its checks and balances to make sure that you are not buying something that, you know, is too much for you. So I'll touch on mortgages in a little bit more detail further on, but let's just say you've, you know, done the calcs, you found out the value of the house, you found out that you can actually get a mortgage. Hurrah! You now want to actually staircase. Great. What do you do now? Find out your managing agent's process of actually staircasing. So the people who own the other half of the property, essentially. Now, more times than not, a lot of them are, you know, quite large housing associations or managing companies, and they will have websites that actually have these documents on them. And you can actually Google it. Normally it's called like the leaseholder intent form for staircasing, but they might call it something different. If you can't find it on their website, just give them a ring and say, listen, I'm interested in staircasing. Could you send me some information? And they normally have booklets and information to send to you. And these are really, really useful because often they kind of lay out your next steps, not in a step-by-step like I'm doing, but they give you an idea of like the next 2 steps that you're going to have to do. So often what you will get is a form. They'll ask you to fill in your details, but also on there, they will actually have a list of specialist surveyors or their preferred surveyors for you to actually get a formal valuation on your property so that they actually can get to know for themselves how much the market value is for the property and for yourself based on a qualified surveyor's opinion. And this is unfortunately with a lot of these managing companies is that they will have their preferred list of surveyors that you have to choose from. And unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, you don't really have a choice about that. You kind of just have to pick from their list. And what I found is that these tend to be a little bit higher priced than, you know, other surveyors on the market. And I think it's because they probably know that they are on the preferred list. But anyway, you need to pick one and write that on the form, pick the surveyor that you've preferred. And also at the same time, you then need to pay an administration fee just for the process and kicking off the process of them kind of writing in their system that you are now interested in staircasing. Now, one other thing I would say about picking the surveyor at this point, if your lease is under 80 years or coming close to being under 80 years, you should probably also look into extending your lease and getting a surveyor who also has a specialism in lease extension is probably worth doing at this point when you're selecting your surveyors, okay? Okay, so you've looked at the form and you've decided, yes, I really do want a staircase. Now, this is the point at where it starts to get serious. If you fill in the form and you submit it to them, you then need to now start taking action. And one of the more kind of solid actions to take is actually calling out the surveyor to come and actually give you a valuation. Now, you've picked a surveyor, they will come and they will give you a valuation of the property. They'll look at it and, you know, do what they do and decide what the market value is. Now, a really important thing to remember at this point is if you have done any DIY work in your flat, you need to inform the surveyor. And if you listen to my video on the pros and cons of shared ownership, you have kept receipts for all the work that you have done. And this is so important because it means that the surveyor can actually look at how much you spent on the property, the work that you have actually done. You're saying that, you know, since I bought this flat, this is what I have brought to the table. This is what I have brought to the value of the property. And he will take a view and actually decide how much value he thinks you have added by the work that you have done. And you can actually get a discount off the price of the 50% that you are now looking to buy. So it's not going to be a straightforward subtraction like, you know, I spent 5 grand, take off 5 grand from the asking price. It's not going to be as straightforward as that, but he will take a view on what that value is that you've actually added, and you can get a couple of grand knocked off. And if you can, why not? So good record keeping is an absolute must if you are not at the point of staircasing yet. And one other quick thing to note is obviously all of this DIY work should have gone through the process of you requesting permission from the managing company so that they always had a record of all the bits and bobs bobs that you did as well. Watch my other video if you want to know what that involves. Okay, so the next thing that happens at this point is the surveyor goes away and he, puts in his system whatever his valuation is, and then he then simultaneously sends his valuation both to you and to the managing company. And you don't need to do anything at this point. Hopefully you're happy with the result of the valuation, but then the managing company will then send out a letter to you, a confirmation of receipt essentially of the surveyor's valuation of the property. Okay, so let's just say the value of your property is £200,000. Your 50% share that you need to now buy will be £100,000. So they'll say, right, it's going to cost you 100 grand to buy the remaining 50%. And what they'll also do at this point is advise you, if you don't want to staircase to 100%, you could staircase and just add an extra 25% or an extra 35%, and they'll give you the alternative options. And as part of this, they'll also tell you what it's going to cost you in terms of rent reduction, because remember, as you're staircasing up, you are owning more and more of this property, and therefore your rent will go down based on the percentage of the property that you start to own. So if you're staircasing to 100%, your rent should go down to 0, and you will no longer owe them rent, and so they will put that on that form as well. And then often they'll say, can you just confirm what percentage you are looking to actually purchase? So you'll write back and say, yeah, dear Mr. Managing Agent, or fill in their form and say, yeah, I'm looking to, extend to 100%. Great. Another thing to actually bear in mind is that once the valuation is done, you actually start the clock on how long the valuation is worth. And, often this is about a 3-month period. So once you've got that valuation, you have to be sure that you're going to be able to go through the entire process of staircasing before the end of that 3-month clock ends. It might vary from valuer to valuer, but you have essentially started the clock. And if you are not able to, fully purchased by that time, you can lose all the money that you've paid to admin and to valuation and all of that jazz. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Okay, so the next thing is now you actually need the money to do it, right? So where does the money come from? Banks. So we need a mortgage for the additional 50%. Now, you already did your affordability check at the beginning, which is great. So you know that there are banks out there willing to lend to you. So you either speak to your mortgage broker and say, right, I am now actually at the point at which I now need a decision in principle to be able to start the process to actually make the purchase. So this is the bit where we now need to actually talk about additional deposit. So whether or not you need additional deposit depends very much on how much equity you actually have in that first percentage of property that you own. Okay, so as your property has been going up in value, how much equity you have in terms of amount in cash would have gone up in value as well. But as a percentage, it would have stayed the same. So what you want to check is what your balance actually is. And, a quick way to do this is just go online to your current mortgage and see balance left to pay. Now, if the balance left to pay is a small amount, you might very well find that you don't actually need a deposit for the entire mortgage. So let me try and give an example of this. If the property was 100 grand when you bought it, and now it's worth 200 grand. And when you bought it, you put a 10% deposit, so a 90% loan to value product. And now you are also looking for a 90% loan to value product, but 90% of 200,000 is £20,000. Now, in that instance, your initial deposit of £10,000 would have already increased to being worth £20,000. And if you're still getting a 90% loan to value product, you don't need an additional deposit. But let's say you want to get an 80% loan to value product. That means the deposit that you're going to need is actually going to be £40,000. And so that £40,000 might not be there as equity in your current property. It depends on how long you've actually actually owned it, how long you've been paying into your mortgage. And I'm assuming you've had a repayment mortgage, so you've been paying down the principal. You could very well have 40 grand in there, especially if you've been overpaying and you've had it for a long time. And that again means you don't need a deposit. But if you have only had it for a short period of time, let's say 2 years, and you haven't been overpaying, it's unlikely that you would have increased the amount of equity you've got in there to the 40%. And at that point, you might have to top up, which is like an additional deposit, to be able to actually get that 40 grand to get to the 80% loan to value that you are trying to get on that mortgage product. I hope that made sense. And so this is the difference between people who might potentially need a deposit at staircasing and people who might not need a deposit at staircasing. It is very much dependent on the mortgage product that you actually get. So this is also the point in time where you want to make sure that you mention the fact that you are wanting to extend the lease. If you are that person whose lease is either getting close to the 80-year mark, so I would say anything from 85 years under, you really need to be looking at extending your lease. You could have a great big whopping bill if your lease goes under 80 years. Do not ever let your lease go under 80 years. So this is a great time to be able to take the opportunity to extend the lease. And if it costs a lot, you could actually potentially fund it through your mortgage as well. So it's a great thing to kind of mention to your broker or mention to the bank in question when you are actually looking to do the mortgage. So essentially you have, you've done well, you now have a mortgage, and if everything has gone according to plan, the bank is giving you the money, your conveyancers have done their job, you've extended the lease, you will now own 100% of your property. Way, well done. And, you will be sent by the managing company a memorandum of staircasing. And it's essentially just a document saying, you now own 100% ownership of the property. And land registry should also update the titles accordingly. So your conveyancers should be able to cover that as well. I hope you found that useful. And, good luck in the staircasing. And, don't let all the processes kind of put you off. I know it does sound like a lot, but I didn't think it was that bad. Just once you go through it step by step, you will actually get there. I think shared ownership is actually a great option for people who aren't able to afford the deposit to buy fully. There are some additional expenses, so feel free to watch my video on the pros and cons, and I shall see you on my next video. Please give me a thumbs up and a subscribe if you are interested in videos about money and mindset, and I will see you on my next video. Bye.